Right. Hello to all of you. Thank you for being here. This is the seminar that we are organizing with my colleague Stéphane Porion and with our research center at Cergy Paris University, as you know, the Agora Research Center. And so we're welcoming today, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Tim Bale on my right and Emma Bale, Professor Emma Bale on my left. And so thank you to both of you. So I would just like to say a word first to say that Tim Bale is Professor of Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University in London. And he worked in finance initially, and then he moved back to academia, and he's taught at a number of universities. But he's also the author that you might know of several books on the British and European, the British Conservative Party, not only, but essentially British politics and European party politics. And you might have used the Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, we have anyway, or the British general election of 2019, or the modern British party system. But he's also well known for writing for The Guardian, The Observer, or like a minute ago being interviewed last minute by the BBC. But today he's here to talk and to discuss his latest book, The Conservative Party After Brexit, Turmoil and Transformation, published by Polity. Just came out, and so we're very, very pleased to receive him and very pleased that he accepted to come to do so. But we're also very pleased that Professor Emma Bale from the University of Savoy agreed to come and to discuss the book with us. And so Emma Bale is Professor of British Politics at the University de Savoie-Mont-Blanc, and her research examines various aspects of state authoritarianism. She's got a very interesting background, first of all in law, and then which brought her then to become this professor of British politics, who today is actually working on democracy. Well, not only. She has published widely, essentially on race, in the journals Race and Class, Theoretical Criminology, Justice, Power and Resistance. She's published also extensively in La Revue Française de la Société Britannique et l'Observatoire de la Société Britannique. She's the author of a book dating back to 2011 with Palgrave Macmillan, Criminal Justice and Neoliberalism, and in 2015, Soft Power and Freedom Under the Coalition. So without further ado, and sorry for the delay, I'll let you start, and I'm just going to sit next up. Thank you. Yes, Christine.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me and for your hospitality, and for everybody for coming today, especially on a Friday afternoon after lunch. I don't think we dare run a seminar in the UK on a Friday afternoon after lunch, so I do, thank you for coming along. Very grateful for that. The Conservative Party after Brexit, Turmoil and Transformation. It's not the best book ever written on the Conservative Party, and in fact it's not even the best book I've written on the Conservative Party, I would say. The best book I wrote on the Conservative Party is The Conservatives Since 1945, which involved a whole lot of archival research at the Bodleian in Oxford, and had quite a sophisticated theoretical framework on party change. It followed that framework right the way through the text in order to test that framework, at the end of which it kind of quantified all the qualitative material in the book. And the book was designed as an answer to calls by quantitative political scientists in the United States for more case studies of party change, with the result that they ignored it completely. Despite the lovely cover from OUP, got hardly any reviews at all. In contrast to a book that's already been mentioned, which is The Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, which got reviewed in The Guardian by Simon Jenkins. It got me into doing broadcast and print media work, and it managed somehow to win a prize for the best book from the Political Studies Association of the UK, and a really nice message from one of my political science heroes, Peter Mayer, and some nice comments even from some Conservative MPs, which I don't think are going to be forthcoming this time around for obvious reasons will become apparent. So when it came to this book and the fact that I managed to get a Leverhulme grant to do some of the research for that book, was I going to once again go for a thematic, quote-unquote scientific approach, or was I going to go for a book with a strong narrative drive? Well, I think the answer is obvious, really. You know, my publisher, Polity, was very keen on me writing, if you like, the story of the Conservatives after Brexit, rather than necessarily approaching it in a more thematic, quote-unquote, scientific way. Now, because of that, it's actually quite difficult, I think, to do what the Americans like to call a book talk about that particular book. In fact, this is the first time I've actually presented this book. I have done podcasts on the book, but that's where I'm kind of interviewed by someone else, so I don't actually have to kind of take people through the book. This is the first time, as I say, I presented it, so in some ways, you know, apologies for that. I don't know what the French equivalent for guinea pigs is, but you are guinea pigs today, so apologies. So first of all, I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then move on to, you know, what the book actually tries to do. I first conceived of the book in 2018 when the Conservative Party was, in essence, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. If you, like me, are a fan of Almodovar, the Spanish filmmaker, you will get that reference. But it was one triggered by, but not necessarily solely, I think, caused by Brexit. I think it also had to do something with the overweening ambition and flaws of those at the top of the Conservative Party. And if we are to understand the Conservative Party at all, I think it's very useful always to remember the Queen Mary historian, now sadly passed away, John Ramsden, who characterised the Conservative Party, and I quote, as an autocracy tempered by assassination. And if you always bear that in mind when you're thinking about the Conservative Party, you won't go too far wrong. What I tend to do when I talk about politics and when I talk about political parties in particular is always to try and remember the four I's, as I call them, and think about things in terms of those four I's. And those I's are ideas, interests, institutions, and individuals. And I would also add to individuals the court, as it were, that surrounds those individuals. And I think when you look at this story in particular, it is the story of politicians who gather around them loyal, or sometimes slightly less loyal, supporters who see it in their interests, as it were, to hang on to the coattails of particular politicians in order, they hope anyway, to further their own political ambitions. So when we're talking about ideas here, we're talking, and I'll come on to this in a little bit more detail, populism, but we're also talking perhaps about Thatcherism or neoliberalism, as some people would call it, and certainly fiscal conservatism. When we're talking about interests, we're talking about those interests in society which would rather taxes were low rather than higher, would rather spending was low rather than higher, would rather the state was smaller rather than bigger. And when we're talking about institutions, we are talking both about how the Conservative Party runs itself, so the rules such as they are, and they are very flexible, it has to be said, when it comes to the Conservative Party, for example, for running leadership contests. But we're also talking obviously about Parliament as well, and the rules that govern Parliament. We're also, of course, talking about the rule of law as well when we're talking about this particular story, both with regard to Brexit and indeed with regard to COVID. And one thing that's been very interesting, and I'll probably mention this again, when I've done interviews about the book, people always want to talk about Brexit, but they very rarely want to talk about COVID. Now, actually, COVID and the government's management, if you can call it that, or mismanagement, I would say, of the coronavirus crisis in the UK, is a big part of the story, and actually quite revealing about ideological strains within the Conservative Party, but I think in some ways reflective of a desire, and I don't know whether this is shared in France, but it's certainly one I think we see in the UK, a desire to just put COVID behind us, to try and forget about it and move on. It also has something to do with the fact that obviously Brexit is seen to have continuing impact on the UK and the Conservative Party, whereas COVID, if you like, is kind of boxed up. That was then and this is now, and we're moving beyond that. But I do think, you know, there's something perhaps more kind of psychological about our desire not really to go there when it comes to COVID. It's almost kind of too painful, as it were, to talk about. So we can touch on that a little bit later. So anyway, that's the reason why I wrote it. You know, I wanted to look at a party that is known for its ability to govern, and normally to govern relatively competently. You know, as I say, going through what amounted to a nervous breakdown, and that in some ways is, I guess, best typified by what happened in the summer of 2019, when the Conservative Party, for the first time ever really, managed to achieve under 10% of the vote in a national election. In other words, in the European Parliament elections that summer, beaten into effectively last place, really, not least by the Brexit Party, which was the successor to UKIP, led by probably one of the most successful politicians, and certainly most successful extra-parliamentary politicians that we've ever seen in the UK, Nigel Farage. And you know, that was, if you like, the absolute low point of the nosedive. And in some ways, what we have seen since then, or what we saw since then, until perhaps Boris Johnson himself ran into trouble, was Boris Johnson managing, you know, to pull off what effectively was a miracle, really, pulling the party out of that nosedive and taking it a few months later to an 80-seat majority in Parliament. So it was the you know, almost the kind of roller coaster, really, that then became the narrative arc, if you like, of the story. So the aim was to write a narrative, but hopefully a relatively authoritative narrative of what had happened to the party since 2016. And the focus is very much on the party, I should say. If you want an account of, for example, the parliamentary manoeuvring around Brexit, there is a much better book that you should read by Meg Russell and Lisa James, which is very, very detailed and takes you through, you know, every twist and turn of the saga at Westminster surrounding Brexit. And obviously I do touch on some of those kind of parliamentary events, but they're not my main focus. My main focus is always the Conservative Party. What I'm really attempting to do in the book, I guess, is to conduct you know, effectively a kind of post-mortem on a living patient, if you like. So I'm trying to anatomise the Conservative Party, you know, which on occasions has appeared as if it has died and then come back to life. And so, you know, what I'm trying to do really is to look at the, if you like, the interaction between the various organs, to use that, you know, somatic or biological metaphor of the party. Very often, political scientists and those of you who do pol sci and perhaps focus on parties will be familiar with this. We tend to break parties up into three component parts. So we look at the party on the ground, which is essentially the activists, the ordinary members. I think what you call in French the militants. Yeah, I hope I got that right. Apologise for my terrible French. So that's the party on the ground. Then we talk about the party in central office, which is essentially the party headquarters, the staffers, as we call them in the UK, the bureaucrats, if you like, of the party. And we also talk then, lastly, about the party in public office, which is the MPs, and maybe also you could use it to talk about local councillors as well. I would add to that, however, that there is another crucial component, integral part of the Conservative Party, maybe not only the Conservative Party, but certainly I think it's a very obvious feature of the Conservative Party when you begin to think about it, and that is what I would call the party in the media. Yeah. And what I want to suggest by that phrase is that it's actually impossible to understand how the Conservative Party works without understanding that the proprietors, the editors, the leader writers, the op-ed writers, the columnists, and even some of the reporters of the print media in the UK are actually an integral part of the Conservative Party. They shouldn't be seen as sort of the Tory supporting newspapers, as they're sometimes called, as if that was somehow kind of, just a choice that they make now and then. Actually, they are very much part and parcel of the party. They help set the party's agenda. They allow groups within the party to put pressure on the leadership. They allow groups within the party to weaponize particular issues or force them to, forget about other issues. They are an extremely important part, if you like, of the Conservative milieu and the conversation within the Conservative Party. And you can't really understand the Conservative Party unless you appreciate that. That's the argument I would make. Now, I'm not saying that any of these people sort of carry some kind of Conservative Party membership card, but they don't need to. They have far more power than the membership more generally, although we'll come on to talk a little bit about the power of the membership. And they certainly have quite a lot more power on occasions than ordinary MPs. Although, as I say, there is this kind of interaction and feedback, if you like, between the other parts of the party, so the party in central office, party in public office, and the party on the ground, and the party in the media. So, it has to be seen as part of this, if you like, almost kind of biological whole, if you like. So the aim really is to also, and this I guess is the main thesis of the book, in as much as a kind of narrative can have a thesis, is to track through the turmoil that I talk about, and it is, it is turmoil, there's no other word for it really, the transformation of the Conservative Party, and I would argue the kind of ongoing transformation of the Conservative Party, whether it's permanent or not, we'll come on to discuss, from being a mainstream centre-right outfit to becoming what I describe as an ersatz populist radical right party of the kind that we are more and more familiar with in continental Europe. Now you can take your pick. I'm not saying the Rassemblement is necessarily simply a populist radical right party, because of course it has its origins in the far right, and the same will be true, for example, of the Sweden Democrats. But we are more used to other parties who don't necessarily have their origins in those essentially kind of fascist undergrounds, becoming quite popular in parts of Scandinavia, for example, and some other European countries. But certainly, without being too alarmist about it, we have seen in the last, couple of decades or so, the rise of these populist radical right parties, some of whom actually make it into government, some of whom support parties in government in the minority situation, and some of whom, are at least on the verge of doing so in other countries. So the aim then is to look at that transformation, to ask if it's happening, and to ask if it is happening, why and how it's happening. Now, of course, some people, and I think particularly, many British Conservatives, would throw up their hands in horror at that idea. They are still very much convinced that they are an ordinary centre-right party in the kind of European mainstream of conservatism, and or Christian democracy. They still see many of those parties, if you like, as their sister parties. But I'm not sure whether those so-called sister parties actually now see the Conservative Party as necessarily as sister parties, as fraternally, if you like, particularly after Brexit, and particularly some of the given some of the rhetoric that Conservative politicians are using, and indeed some of the politicians that Conservative Party politicians are, policies that Conservative politicians are espousing. Now, I think it is easy to overdo this, okay, and so I want to issue straight away a kind of preemptive caveat, if you like, to say that I think sometimes the parallels, for example, between Boris Johnson and Boris Trump. Oops, Freudian slip. Donald Trump. I think they can be overdrawn. You know, I cannot, for the life of me, believe that Boris Johnson would ever have not accepted election defeat and, you know, encouraged his supporters to march on Westminster, you know, and gate crash it and, you know, start destroying people's offices and even threaten people's lives, etc., etc. I mean, that is simply just, you know, not what Boris Johnson is. I think some of the parallels, you know, drawn with other politicians are perhaps a little bit less overdrawn, but still probably overdrawn. So, you know, there is now a tendency sometimes to even draw parallels between, say, Boris Johnson and someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary. But if you know anything about Orban and the way that he has used the state, abused the state, misused the state, and the extent of, you know, what is, some would say, out-and-out corruption in that country, again, that looks quite far-fetched, although some of the so-called democratic backsliding that we have seen in Hungary and in Poland perhaps does have at least some foreshadowing or at least some echoes, if you like, in the UK under the current Conservative Party. If there is one politician with whom Boris Johnson, I think, can be fairly compared, it would be someone like Silvio Berlusconi. And many of you, and I know Catherine is aware of this, might recall that Boris Johnson, when he was a journalist, along with another journalist, once visited Berlusconi quite early on in the kind of Berlusconi regime in his castle or his villa somewhere in Italy, and came away extremely impressed with Berlusconi, and clearly, in some ways, I think in retrospect, with the realisation that he too could pull off the same trick. So in other words, he too could break the rules in a way that, you know, other politicians couldn't necessarily do, that he would too be seen as the kind of lovable rogue that some people would take to their hearts and forgive almost any transgression. And I think there is a parallel to be drawn there. But having said that you can overdo some of those parallels, I don't think it's going too far to say that there is, if you like, a journey that the Conservative Party is on towards the populist radical right. Now, why do I say that? Well, I think if you look at some of the rhetoric that Conservative Party politicians, in particular Johnson, but by no means just Johnson, but, you know, if he's the most obvious one, and you look at the rhetoric that was used during the Brexit campaign on the Leave side, and you look at some of the rhetoric that was then used to, quote-unquote, get Brexit done, and then you look at some of the rhetoric that has been used ever since then, particularly on the issue of migration, you will see that it is, I would say, inherently populist, by which I mean, you know, to use the Kasmuda definition that seems to be kind of the accepted definition now, it counterposes the pure people against supposedly corrupt, and it doesn't necessarily mean financially corrupt, but maybe morally corrupt elite who have no understanding and no sympathy with the people. You can see this not just in the way that migration is talked about, but in the way that expertise is sometimes denigrated, in which the neutral civil service is attacked as somehow inherently biased against the Conservative Party and characterised as, to coin a phrase, the blob. The attacks on the judiciary, and if not the judiciary, then what are now routinely referred to as lefty lawyers by Conservative ministers, particularly when they are trying to block what those ministers say they want to do with regard to migration. And you can also see it if you sort of dig a little bit deeper, and I'm sure Emma will have a better appreciation of this than me because she's the law expert. You can see that there is some grounds to believe that we are on the way to that sort of democratic backsliding that I was talking about earlier. Not in extremis yet, but certainly some of the signs I think are quite worrying. The most obvious example would be the intention of the British government before the Northern Ireland Windsor Framework was agreed with the EU very recently to break international law, although as the phrase had it, only in certain specific ways. You can also see now that what the government is trying to do in its Borders and Nationality Bill in the last few days, it's accepted some amendments from the kind of right of the Conservative Party, will put the UK in contravention of the UN Charter, in the sense it will make it virtually impossible, in the degree to which it is impossible we've yet to see, for anyone claiming asylum in the UK to do so legally, unless they have come through some kind of authorised route. And by authorised route, then we are only talking at the moment anyway about Ukrainians, about people from Hong Kong, and about a limited number of people from Afghanistan. Apart from that, that's it. And certainly for those people coming on inflatable boats across the Channel, they are going to be deemed illegal from the get-go. There may be some exceptions made, and this is the current debate going on about the bill going through, for children and for people deemed to be in danger of being enslaved, but that is the limit. So in other words, asylum seeking is effectively rendered illegal, which obviously is in contravention of the UN Charter and probably the European Convention on Human Rights as well. And there is a serious debate within the Conservative Party about withdrawing from the European Convention completely. Now, I suspect that is something that is, in the end, not going to happen because it would cause too many ripples across a whole range of policies, not least, obviously, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which relies on us being signatories to the European Convention. But again, Emma will probably know more about that than me as well. But if we just look at it and move away from domestic law, we can look at, move away from international law, we can look at some domestic issues as well. So we've had the government pull the electoral commission, which was, almost completely autonomous from the government, towards being now responsible to ministers, in the sense that ministers now, because of legislation passed, will write the remit for the electoral commission, which wasn't the case before. Now, that's not absolutely necessarily worrying, but what is the reason for that? Presumably because the electoral commission was doing and saying things that the government didn't like, in particular fining Conservative MPs and the Conservative Party for failing to comply with electoral law on a number of occasions. I would also add there the introduction of voter ID. Now, it's something that obviously will not be unfamiliar to most people in continental Europe, that you have to show photo identification before you vote, but that has never been the case outside of Northern Ireland in the UK. And there is absolutely no evidence that this kind of electoral fraud was widespread. hardly any prosecutions for what we call personification, in other words, pretending to be someone else when you vote. I mean, literally a handful over the last few years. So it was, in some senses, a kind of, solution searching for a problem. And many people, most electoral experts, I think, would agree that, the likelihood is that it's intended to suppress the vote among people who might otherwise vote against the Conservatives. In other words, learning from the Americans that, creating obstacles to people voting often means creating obstacles to people who you don't think will vote for you, and in particular younger people, ethnic minorities, etc., etc. Just as a kind of, I don't want to disappear down that rabbit hole, but we will see the test of this in local elections in May, because this is the first time that this has been brought in. And if you look at survey work being done, it would appear that a fairly large tranche of people are not aware of this new regulation, and that we may find that they turn up at polling stations in May without the requisite ID. The fear is that when they are turned away, that will cause incidents, or at the very least, it will cause them, not to come back with the required ID, either because they don't possess it or because they don't have time to go back and get it. And obviously, the more sort of conspiratorial critics of the government point to the fact that, for example, there are forms of ID which are acceptable for the over 65s. So, for example, what we call an Oyster card in London, but only for the over 65s. So, in other words, if you've got a student Oyster card, that's not acceptable ID. But an over 65 Oyster card, that is acceptable ID. It's difficult really to believe the government's justifications for that. Having said that, I think there is sometimes a little bit too much alarm about what the government wants to do. So, for example, in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019, there were promises that they were going to do something about judicial review. That doesn't actually seem to have happened. There's a kind of almost continual promise on the part of the government to either repeal or amend the Human Rights Act, which allows people to take cases domestically rather than going to Strasbourg in order to have them judged. The Conservatives are always saying they're going to do that, and they never quite do it. So, there's perhaps less to worry about than some think. But nevertheless, I think there's a degree of democratic backsliding, at least at early stage, that we need to worry about. And then, of course, we've already referred to it. There is the migration policy and the illegalisation of asylum seeking. But also the solution to that is, arguably, you could say, out of the populist playbook. So either at the moment people are going to be housed on barges or ships off the coast of the UK, or they're going to be housed in former prisons or army and other military camps. On the basis that at the moment they're housed in hotels, and this is costing the taxpayer, which is in some ways a kind of a euphemism or equivalent of the people, the taxpayer, an awful lot of money. And in the long term, of course, supposedly they will be deported to Rwanda in Africa. The problem with that, as you may know, is that at the moment we have had the European Court of Human Rights block those deportations, so those flights haven't taken off. The other problem is that actually is only a few hundred can be accommodated in Rwanda, even if those flights do take off, when we are talking about tens of thousands of people coming over on boats from France to the UK. The other thing I should say about the Rwanda solution, in as much as it is a solution, is it's very important to realise this, and many people in the UK don't realise this, but it's not as if you will be deported to Rwanda, have your claim processed in Rwanda, and then if your claim is upheld, be allowed to come back to the UK as a refugee. That is not what is going to happen. You will be deported to Rwanda, your case will be heard in Rwanda. If you are accepted as a refugee, you will stay in Rwanda. You will have absolutely no right to come back to the UK. That's it. Okay, so that is a pretty draconian solution, when of course it isn't really a solution to a problem. So the question is then why and how this transformation that I'm talking about has occurred. I think the underlying reason is the threat from the populist radical right that the Conservative Party has had to face really since the early 2000s. And it's a nightmare which in some ways the Conservative Party shares with many of its continental counterparts. Okay, the fear that you will be outflanked on your right by a party that is offering, if you like, harder line solutions to a whole range of problems than you as a mainstream Conservative or Christian Democratic Party, either ideologically or electorally, are able to offer people. Now, as I say, that's a fairly common nightmare. You know, I don't need to tell you in France that that nightmare is in some senses already coming true, or has come true for quite some time, and certainly for Les Républicains, I mean, they're gone, and they seem to have been effectively replaced by the Rassemblement. So, but if you also look at the CDU-CSU in Germany, they are very worried about the AfD there. And that, of course, you know, is takes us back to the kind of golden era of the CSU, when it was all about, you know, preventing any kind of resurgence of the far right in Germany. But you can see a whole range of centre-right parties throughout Europe having to cope with this nightmare. And if you're interested, there is another book which we edited together with Cristóbal Rovira-Kaltwasser, which is about, you know, the mainstream right in Europe, and it's called Riding the Populist Wave. So if you're interested in the sort of comparative side of things, well, I might as well advertise that book as well while I'm here. Cambridge University Press, £20 now. The reason why that nightmare is so extreme in the UK is something that we have to understand. Because in the long term, for other centre-right parties in Europe, although they start off by saying this will never happen, and they certainly probably don't want it to happen, in the end, because nearly all European countries operate some kind of proportional representation, if the populist radical right or the far right get a decent number of votes, they will also get a decent number of seats in Parliament, which means that for the centre-right, there is the possibility of forming a coalition with those parties, or even if they don't want to form a coalition, at least getting the support of those parties for a centre-right government, right? Because of the electoral system in the UK, that is not a possibility. So that nightmare is even more feverish for the Conservative Party. Because of first past the post, it is perfectly possible for a populist radical right party to drain large numbers of votes from the Conservative Party, but that not to result in any seats for that populist radical right party, meaning that the Conservative Party cannot take advantage, if you like, or at least cannot do any kind of deal after the election. And the obvious illustration of that is the 2015 general election. Now, fortunately for the Conservative Party, because they managed to cannibalise the Liberal Democrats, who they'd gone into coalition with in 2010, it wasn't as extreme a problem as they feared it might be. But UKIP, as it was then called, as you probably know, got something like 13% of the vote, 4 million votes, but only one seat in Parliament. So had David Cameron not managed to cannibalise the Liberal Democrats and not managed to win a majority of his own, he would have been in real trouble because of that. Now, Conservative MPs are not normally worried about losing their seats to UKIP or the Brexit Party, although they were in 2019, I have to say, you know, when you know, they were on the verge of the nervous breakdown. So much as worrying about that party or that formation taking votes away from them and allowing their seats then to go to the Liberal Democrats or to the Labour Party. So that's always the worry. So in other words, that that although the populist radical right won't win seats, it will actually win votes that otherwise would have gone to the Conservative Party, with the result that Labour will win the seat or the Liberal Democrats will win the seat. So there's a double threat, if you like, just to re-emphasise, hopefully at not too great a length, from the populist radical right for the Conservative Party. A, it will steal votes from them and mean they will lose seats to opposition parties. And B, the votes that those populist radical right parties get will not be translated into seats in Parliament, and therefore will in effect be of no use to the Conservative Party if they themselves can't form a majority. So hopefully I've explained that reasonably clearly. Now, the other reason I think why we have this sort of transformation, or this ongoing transformation, is that in 2017 and 2019, the Conservatives realised that they could put together a new electoral coalition, if you like. And some people would actually say it's an old electoral coalition. I know, Catherine knows an awful lot about the politics of the 19th century, and you can argue that in some ways what's happening, and you could perhaps look to the 1950s as well, and say, well, the Conservative electoral coalition is essentially a third and maybe plus of working class voters on the one hand, and then the almost entire middle class on the other. And you can argue that in some ways what we saw in 2017 and 2019 is that electoral coalition being put back together. You can also argue that it was the electoral coalition and in some ways helped Margaret Thatcher to power during the 1980s. So in other words, it is a combination of fairly affluent voters, normally living in the south of England, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a bunch of voters who are able to swing marginal constituencies in the Midlands and to some extent the north of England, who look very different, who are working class, who are certainly white, so that's not much of a difference there, but are less affluent and less educated. They're not graduates, for example. They would have left school at 16. Some of them would have even left school because they're more elderly at 14. And have the attitudes, if you like, to match. So they are culturally very conservative. So even if it isn't necessarily in their interests to have a conservative government in terms of public services, it is in their interests in terms of their cultural beliefs, most obviously about immigration. So you can argue that the kind of culture war politics that seems to go with this populist turn makes electoral sense for the Conservative Party, at least in the short term. And this is something that Theresa May realised for all her apparent social liberalism. And it was certainly something that Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson realised. So in other words, it was an attempt to put into a general election context what had been achieved by Vote Leave in the 2016 European referendum. This combination, if you like, of comfortable leavers on the one hand and then more working class leavers on the other. Some of you may be aware that sometimes that second set of voters are characterised as red wall voters. This is because they live in constituencies that formerly seem to belong to the Labour Party, and and therefore it was the kind of red wall. It was always a sort of solid phalanx of Labour constituencies that then fell to the Conservatives in 2019 after almost falling to the Conservatives in 2017. And it's very important to realise that if I don't know if any of you follow football, but if you do follow football, Theresa May gave Boris Johnson a big assist by doing some of the groundwork in 2017. What I should also stress, however, is that actually mobilising those cultural conservatives, many Conservative MPs realise, doesn't necessarily mean that they have to give up their ideas of, if you like, fiscal conservatism or fiscal consolidation. So it's perfectly possible, although awkward sometimes, because those voters actually want to see money spent on on public services, but it is perfectly possible to try and mobilise those voters on cultural concerns without actually spending the money that they want to be seen spent on public services. It's a strain. That's something we'll talk about in the book a little bit, but it's not impossible, as Mrs. Thatcher also found as well. But of course, it was much easier for Mrs. Thatcher because the economy was, after a while anyway, growing, partly because we had so much North Sea oil coming on stream. It also took, if we're looking at why and how this populist transformation has occurred, it also obviously took an entrepreneurial populist politician like Boris Johnson to come along, and also what I would call celebrity Brexiteers like Boris Johnson. So, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who in some ways helped pull the Conservative grassroots in this direction as well. And it's sometimes easy to run away with the idea that the Conservative grassroots were always very kind of pro-Brexit, wanted to leave the European Union, couldn't stand Europe, wanted out straight away. Not in fact the case. When we did surveys, with my other hat on, we do surveys of Conservative Party members. When we asked Conservative Party members in 2015, before the Brexit referendum, about how they were going to vote, most of them said, well, we're going to wait to see what David Cameron comes back with a deal from Brussels, and then we'll make up our minds. So it wasn't as if, they were absolutely determined to leave the European Union at that stage. Fast forward to 2018, 2019, when, they get surveyed, you get a Conservative Party membership, I think 2/3 of whom said they would rather see the breakup of the Conservative Party than not leave the European Union. In fact, they would rather even see the breakup of the UK, Scotland to leave, Northern Ireland to leave, than not leave the European Union. So you get this radicalisation of the grassroots, I think, through these celebrity politicians. They become incredibly popular. And if you've ever been to a Conservative Party conference, you will know that they are treated like celebrities. I mean, they are, you can go into a meeting and see Jacob Rees-Mogg, fawned upon, worshipped by a bunch of old ladies and old men, and B, a bunch of 19-year-old men, just men, because they were only boys a couple of years ago in three-piece suits, and some women / girls as well. So I think that's important as well. But what's also important is the party and the media. And there's this interaction, if you like, between the celebrity Brexiteers and the party in the media, because their views are continually pushed by the party in the media. And we're talking here about the Telegraph, we're talking about the Mail, we're talking about the Sun, we're talking about the Express, we're talking about the Spectator. And in more recent years or months, we're talking about GB News, which is this new news channel, which is very much the news channel of the kind of culture warriors as well. So the party in the media has quite a lot to do with this. In supporting another aspect of this, some of these so-called ginger groups within the Conservative Party, like the European Research Group, like during COVID, the COVID Recovery Group, and there's a kind of overlap, if you like, between the CRG and the ERG. And what's also important in this, in the kind of celebrification of some politicians, is, I think, social media as well, and sort of 24/7 media that we now have, just as you have in France and other European countries. Because I think it's encouraged, and this is, Catherine's ears might prick up here, it's encouraged among Conservative MPs the decline of deference. It's been ongoing for decades. But it is now possible, really, as a Conservative MP, to go from nothing, in other words, to enter Parliament for the first time, and to become well known in a matter of days or even weeks, giving you a kind of status within the party that you could not possibly have hoped to have in earlier years. And also, therefore, to give you the idea that you should be on the front bench, you should be in the cabinet, and perhaps you should even be Prime Minister, even though you have absolutely no ministerial experience and haven't served your apprenticeship. Now, I don't think it's just to do with social media. You know, as I say, it's an ongoing process. It partly has to do with the fact that David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party in 2005 after just 4 years in Parliament. And if you look at previous Conservative PMs, it took them a lot longer to become Prime Minister. So I think that kind of deference is also important. But I would also say, and I'm beginning to wrap up now, Emma will be pleased to hear, that you know, this is a long-term process, and it's a long-term strain within the Conservative Party, populism. You can trace it back, if you want, to the 19th century, when the Conservative Party was the party of the brewers, the party of the party of nation and empire, which counterposed itself to the kind of po-faced liberal manufacturers of the Liberal Party. You can trace it back to Margaret Thatcher's so-called authoritarian populism, to coin that Marxist epithet. You can trace it back to William Hague in 2001, talking about, you know, taking people to a foreign land and talking about these sort of chattering classes, these elites that you know, didn't understand the common sense of ordinary people, unlike the Conservative Party. So it hasn't come out of nowhere, this populism. I've been talking about the kind of more recent events. It hasn't come out of nowhere, but I guess what I would argue is that the Conservative Party has for a long time flirted with populism, borrowed from populism, exploited populism, but it hasn't actually swallowed it whole. Okay, so it hasn't actually become part of the, you know, the sort of DNA of the Conservative Party, but I would suggest now it probably has become part of the DNA of the Conservative Party. If you like, then populism and populist radical right feeling within the Conservative Party was perhaps always latent. Yeah, it was possibly always latent. And David Cameron, by calling that referendum, essentially, to coin the cliche, opened Pandora's box on it. I think then you have Theresa May, who comes along and basically lifts the lid completely off Pandora's box. And then you have Boris Johnson, who comes along and not only takes that lid, but actually just throws it away, and basically everything then has poured out. And then to switch an analogy, once the genie is out of the bottle, as we say in England, it's very, very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. So the question now really is whether that transformation I'm talking about is A, how far it's gone, B, whether it can be temporary, whether it's just, you know, yet another example of this incredibly adaptable outfit called the Conservative Party, and whether we will then see it, you know, gradually begin to, you know, move back towards a kind of more mainstream centre-right position, or whether actually it's a road along which the Conservative Party is now kind of destined to travel, which might not mean that it becomes, if you like, the Fidesz of the UK, but certainly means that it won't be a kind of mainstream Conservative Party in the way that we've come to understand it and still understand it in other European countries. And then the final question really that I leave you with is, if this transformation is permanent, if it is an ongoing transformation, there's two final questions really. A, where will it end? Quite how far will it go? And B, is it actually in the Conservative Party's electoral interests in the long term? Given that the UK is becoming more multicultural, more multi-ethnic, more socially liberal, you know, is it the case that it will be good for a couple of elections yet? Okay, and maybe they might win the 2024 elections with the kind of stop the boats rhetoric, etc., etc. Okay, but in the long term, is it a dead end? That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim, and thanks very, very much to Catherine and Stefana for inviting me along today. It's been a privilege to get an early copy of your book, which I really enjoyed reading. It's a really entertaining read, full of plots and intrigue, betrayal and backstabbing. But there is, of course, as is to be expected, some really astute political analysis, of course, there. And I suppose what we really see is I think your focus tends to be very much on power and trying to understand, I suppose, how the party and individual leaders in the Conservative Party managed to hold on to power. Of course, this is what the Conservative Party has always been about, seeing itself as that natural party of government, being prepared to compromise and adapt in order to stay in power. But I suppose what we see here is that it seems to be becoming increasingly desperate and taking more and more risks in order to be able to stay there. It gives us a really great insight into the individual leaders, dealing with 4 leaders, no less, in a very short period of time. We see, for example, Theresa May being described as being passive rather than active. I quite enjoyed the quotation that you presented, saying that she literally needed notes to be saying it's great to be here in Slough again. It seemed to sum up that weakness particularly well. Johnson is portrayed really as the power-hungry opportunist. It seems that it's his charisma and perception of his authenticity that seemed to contribute to his popularity, but that his moral failure ultimately brought him down. Sunak certainly appears to be more about competence rather than charisma, but it's unsure, of course, how long that will last. And of course, scandals in recent weeks have shown that he is also tainted by sleaze and some concerns about his own moral probity. And I suppose what the book reveals is the extremely difficult challenges that party leaders must face, regardless of their personal skills or perhaps lack thereof. So we see these constant challenges from the leadership hopefuls, from the Conservative Party in Parliament, and the extent to which that can constrain their actions. You show how May, as a reluctant Remainer, ended up pushing for a hard Brexit, given that 65% of Leave-supporting MPs chose not to vote for her. So she really needed to try to get them on side. She ended up appointing those prominent Leavers, Boris Johnson to the FCO, and David Davis to the new department for exiting the EU. And you suggested this was akin to a regime change, and that Theresa May really ended up being taken hostage to a certain extent by her own party. And then that even moving to this hard Brexit was just never enough. It was, their appetite, the hard Brexiteers' appetite was insatiable. And already even when Theresa May really first announced her hard Brexit deal in the Lancaster House speech in January 2017, Tim, you showed that the Ultras were already talking about a no deal, even at that point, as a reality. And I suppose there's maybe a certain suggestion at the end that maybe we might see Sunak as being portrayed as a hostage to the culture warriors, but we can come back to that later. It was really fascinating. You put a lot of emphasis on that, of what you describe as the bewildering array of internal groups trying to make their voice heard. It is indeed quite difficult to keep track of the number of different internal groups, and we see that there are warring factions there as well. So you have the more ultra-liberal groups, the ERG, the COVID recovery group as well that were mentioned. And then those who are in favour of more state intervention, like the Northern Research Group, that most certainly do not agree. Of course, Tim, at the beginning you mentioned the individual interests of MPs, those power ambitions of MPs that surround leaders, which is something of an irony because, as you point out, one of the key criterion for appointing a new leader is the capacity of that leader to keep the party together and to provide unity. That was apparently also a criterion when it came to appointing Keir Starmer. He hasn't lived up to that terribly well either. You've already mentioned this decline of deference. You talk about the plots that there have been, the so-called pork pie plots to get rid of of Boris Johnson, and then Liz Truss organising her Fizz with Liz, little parties with a bit of Prosecco probably, I imagine it wasn't champagne for Liz Truss, to try to court potential supporters should there be a leadership challenge. And of course, the party and the media you emphasise, and in your talk today, of course, as being absolutely crucial. I think that's really interesting, that the idea of it being an integral part of the party. And it seems that it did have some kind of role in also pushing the party further to the right than maybe it might have gone otherwise. We've seen how the press led the crusade against the judges, you know, the Daily Mail's famous Enemies of the People headline, the Sun supporting the prorogation of Parliament, the party and the media advancing conspiracy theories, such as suggesting that the so-called Surrender Act, which was the bill that was introduced to prevent Boris Johnson from leading the UK out of the EU without any kind of a deal. It was suggested that this act had actually been drawn up by the EU and the French government. The party and the press waging the war on woke, the war against the BBC, against the universities accused of stifling free speech, their support for economic liberalism, supporting Liz Truss's mini-budget, the Daily Mail, with its headline, welcoming the new mini-budget as at last a true Tory budget. You mentioned the role of the think tanks also, Policy Exchange, urging the party to move towards the war on woke. And then, of course, that pressure from rank and file members. But then, of course, we see the division that there is sometimes between the rank and file members and the general public. Notably, you mentioned the COVID crisis, whereas the majority of the public was generally in favour of reasonably tough restrictions, whereas you had the Tory membership absolutely opposed to that. The divisions that there are, of course, the idea of the levelling up agenda, addressing those social issues, the public spending being limited very much by chancellors. You describe both Hammond and Sunak as fiscal hawks, preventing prime ministers from perhaps introducing more state intervention. And of course, then you very much you've highlighted a lot in your talk that move towards populism, and to move on then maybe just a few points of discussion really. The focus on power struggles in the book, I suppose that leads you to focus maybe a little bit less on ideology, on the ideas, and it certainly seems clear that in this period, at least, there is no one clear, unified, coherent ideological project. But you do certainly highlight the hardline, neoliberal or hyper-globalist, is the term, use ideology of the Brexit ultras, whose zeal for a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit was near religious, to use your term. Now, obviously, Liz Truss has been forced out, but she hasn't gone. And just recently, she described her forced resignation as a setback. So perhaps I suppose my question is, to what extent do you think that strand is still very strong? To what extent might that strand win out over the kind of one nation levelling up agenda? To what extent might that ideology be perhaps undermined by the culture wars, so given that there's an obvious contradiction between the idea of a global Britain and closed borders, with new trade deals that the UK wants to sign, notably with India, for example. It's obviously going to cause extreme difficulties for the government if it does not open up its borders to some extent there in exchange. Or, on the other hand, might the culture wars help the party to push that agenda through? Given that this is an extremely useful distraction, perhaps, that can be pushed through behind closed doors while everybody's focused on the statue wars or whatever the latest culture war issue happens to be. And as I've said, you obviously place a lot of emphasis on the party and the media, and I think this is really, really important. There's somewhat less emphasis placed on the think tanks. Maybe if we look at trying to understand Thatcherism, certainly there's been a lot more work done on the role of think tanks there. Are think tanks maybe less important? It was said that Tufton Street was very, very important when it came to Liz Truss's agenda, but to what extent is it? Are they still relevant? And which think tanks maybe might be the most relevant there? You also suggest that there's been something like something of a hard right takeover of the party, which I suppose suggests maybe that Conservative party leaders, that their hardline attitudes are down to pressure. We mentioned earlier the idea of Theresa May as a hostage, or down to political expediency. Boris Johnson as the opportunist just playing to the hard right gallery in the parliamentary party or in the electorate. But could it also be said maybe that politicians have been following their own deeply conservative instincts here? Maybe that's less the case of Johnson, despite his racist comments. But certainly May, you mention in the book that Hammond described her as being obsessed with immigration. And obviously, the immigration policies we're seeing now were initially laid really by Theresa May and her hostile environment policies. And Rishi Sunak, it was just yesterday in The Guardian, Jessia Elgott was suggesting that Sunak is profoundly conservative in his views on immigration, on drugs, on transgender rights. And I suppose that leads me to the point that you came to at the very end of your talk as well, which is, the book is called Turmoil and Transformation. Obviously, the turmoil is absolutely evident here. 3 prime ministers in a single term, never before seen. But that question of transformation, the transformation of the party. This move towards the radical right, and I would certainly agree with you here. And if we take Cass Mood's definition of the extreme right or the radical right, he talks about nationalism. So we certainly see in the Conservative Party this national populism, particularly linked to pride in the colonial past. We're certainly seeing racism and xenophobia in these new immigration laws. Certainly racism is inherent in this reinforced immigration control, which necessarily, of course, involves racial profiling. In the strong state, the clamping down on protest, reinforcing police powers, the hostility to democracy. You mentioned, for example, judicial review. Yes, the Conservatives haven't gone too far on that yet. They did pass a law in 2022 that limited judicial review in immigration cases, but I think they're still probably going to push to go further there. And perhaps even the lack of support for pluralism, even within their own party, as we saw with the elimination of the new wets, I suppose we might call them. And so I suppose it often seems that extremism is somehow unconservative. Did you say yourself the Conservatives have slipped their moorings as a mainstream centre-right party? And so what extent is this really new? Hasn't the Conservative Party always oscillated between a more moderate, more extremist wings? Corey Robin, the American expert on conservatism, of course, he has said that conservatism has not always been moderate, and that there is this long tradition of conservative leaders adopting what, of course, you mentioned earlier, Stuart Hall referred to as authoritarian populism, notably Thatcher, who very much stoked the culture wars and pursued a populist agenda in the 1980s. So when you say that it's a journey to the radical right, I think you probably agree with me, given what you said at the end, is that it's a journey that it's been on for a while. So maybe it's not so much transformation as slow, incremental evolution. I mean, maybe what I talked about before in my own work was this kind of, you know, soft authoritarianism. Maybe we've just moved from that soft to a much harder, more overt form of authoritarianism. And that leads me, and I'm going to let you answer some of these, to think just about the wider effect that this has had on UK politics as well. And you know, to what extent now we are seeing this drift towards populism. And I think it's always been present in the Labour Party. Certainly, I've talked before about the penal populism that we saw under the last Labour government. And we certainly see the Labour Party under Keir Starmer engaging in those culture wars, and we saw that the latest kind of nasty political campaign, of course, suggesting that Rishi Sunak was involved, was perhaps soft on child sex offenders, and perhaps even in cahoots with paedophiles, which really takes up that kind of conspiracy theory that we saw even in the United States, you know, with Trump accusing Clinton of being involved in paedophile gangs. Yes. I will, yeah. I think that's enough to be getting on with, probably. Sorry.
So I'll just give a few thoughts to that. And thank you so much for obviously reading the book so carefully, and for some great questions, not all of which I have particularly satisfactory answers to. I mean, I think you know, one of your questions is really about Rishi Sunak and the extent to which Sunak is you know, a kind of, if you like, a kind of liberal centrist who had to put up with this populist turn while he was rising to the top, and now will gradually kind of reset and put the Conservative Party back on a more conventional, you know, centre-right journey. I mean, I think that's something that we're all kind of wrestling with. I think Jess Elgott's piece in The Guardian about him, however, probably is reflective of a reality, which is that he's no such thing. Although he looks like this kind of shiny globalist, who you can imagine, you know, some people generating conspiracy theories about, he's actually a very conservative, culturally conservative politician, who, you know, is perfectly willing to kind of wield the populist weapons that Boris Johnson and some of his predecessors were willing to wield. And of course, he was a Brexiteer avant la lettre, if you like, and you know, continues to be so. Although there is a question, and I pose it in the book, as to whether someone as intelligent and financially savvy as Rishi Sunak can actually persuade himself. And by the way, there's a very good piece in the Financial Times today by Simon Cooper on you know, this wider question. Can actually still persuade himself that Brexit was a good idea. I mean, I do find it difficult to believe that someone like Rishi Sunak, who is, you know, for all his ideology, a fairly kind of rational person, I find it difficult to believe that, unless he's kind of lying to himself, which is of course perfectly possible because we all do that and politicians will do it as well, can continue to think that Brexit was a great idea. Unless, of course, he continues with the fantasy that we will only, you know, and this is the Rees-Mogg line, we'll only know in 60 years' time whether it was a good idea or not. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. But to come back to this question about, I don't think Sunak was a kind of innocent bystander in what went on in the last few years. I think he was very much involved in it. And certainly, the only difference between him and Liz Truss is that they're two varieties of Thatcherism. In some senses, he is the real Thatcherite, in the sense that he actually understands that Margaret Thatcher was quite a cautious politician and always wanted to get the money in first before she doled it out in tax cuts, whereas Liz Truss, in some senses, believed in the kind of mythical Margaret Thatcher, who made tax cuts straight away, didn't really care about balancing the budget, etc., etc. The problem, of course, for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt is that he hasn't got an available source of income like Margaret Thatcher had, apart obviously from taxation. So given that it's going to be very difficult in the run-up to an election to cut public services much more than he can, all he can do is try and hold down public spending and actually to some extent increase taxes in the hope that he'll be able to decrease taxes just before the election and help win the election that way. But there is a really serious problem for Conservative Thatcherites now, is that they cannot possibly hope to get the growth rates that Margaret Thatcher had in the 1980s by those huge sectoral reforms that she made, by those privatisations that she made, by all the North Sea oil that we had. So how are they going to do it unless they actually cut very large parts of the state? But given that David Cameron and George Osborne have already basically cut things to the absolute bone, it's quite hard to see how that Thatcherite recipe can work. And certainly it can't, the Liz Truss version of it can't work because it doesn't have the confidence of the market. So we are stuck in a very difficult place, and the Conservatives are. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the plotting is a big feature of the book, and I think that's a problem for the Conservative Party, in the sense that just as we've in many European countries moved to ape America in the sense of having a permanent campaign, we also have a permanent leadership campaign in the Conservative Party. There is you cannot understand what happened during COVID, for example, without understanding that Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss were continually running a leadership campaign. They both of them were absolutely determined that they were going to take over from Boris Johnson, and almost everything they did was either down to, in Sunak's case, his ideology about not having too big a state, opening up, being business friendly, etc., etc. But it was also about courting the party and the media, which was desperately pushing for lockdowns not to happen, lockdowns to end earlier than they should do, etc., etc., etc. So I think that permanent leadership campaign is quite destabilising. Now, of course, I realise, even when I quote John Ramsden, that to some extent, Conservative politicians, partly because it is such a leadership-oriented party, are always thinking about, their leadership prospects. But I think it's true to say that the whole process has accelerated and speeded up. So it's not as if people will give the current leader a little bit of time before they start campaigning for themselves. They're almost into kind of campaign mode as soon as one leadership contest has happened. People are thinking about, well, who's going to replace this person when there's another leadership contest? And of course, given what's happened, I guess that's not going to change anytime soon. I think you're absolutely right, although you didn't use this phrase, to identify particular critical junctures in the story. And you are absolutely right to say Theresa May's very early definition of Brexit as what we would all understand as a hard Brexit was absolutely crucial. And there is a great, say that, it's terrible. There's a great part in the book where she gives this conference speech in 2016, and Philip Hammond, who is her Chancellor, has had no access to what she's going to say when she defines Brexit as leaving the single market and essentially leaving the customs union or not. And he is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's the Finance Minister, and he is sitting there with cameras on him in the conference hall, literally just having to pretend to smile. He says, I just have to have this rictus smile, he says. Knowing that, he then has to fly off to Washington to a meeting of the IMF, and by the time he's landed, the pound is falling through the floor, and he's having to reassure the IMF that the whole Brexit process can be controlled and it won't be as extreme. And then you are also absolutely right to say Theresa May's other great mistake was to utter those infamous words, "No deal is better than a bad deal," because once she does that, she actually legitimises what people are already talking about, as you say, in the RG, which is the idea of leaving without a deal. And once that gets into people's heads that is a possibility, she's gone. And obviously when she loses the 2017 election, or at least doesn't win it, she is, to quote George Osborne, it's an unfortunate phrase, a dead woman walking. Although, yeah, I wouldn't have gone so far as to suggest that, as George Osborne did, she should be chopped up and put in his freezer. Anyway, that was a little bit extreme. You're right to say that there isn't, obviously, this isn't a party that now has one clear, very strong ideology, because I've already talked about the kind of the two Thatcherisms that it's operating with. But you're also absolutely right to say there is obviously a potential contradiction between, on the one hand, running this kind of cultural conservative culture war politics and the kind of open global Britain, buccaneering, free trading, neoliberal UK that Conservatives were also proposing. And I think you are absolutely right to say the trade deal with India will be really interesting, because India is clearly pushing for increased visas for Indian citizens as a quid pro quo, if you like, for access to the Indian market. So if that ever happens, that's going to be a problem. But having said that, one of the absolutely fascinating things about Britain since 2016 is the huge rise in immigration from outside Europe. And that there is many people would say a delicious or you could say horrific irony between people voting in 2016 to bring the numbers down, whatever people say. They wanted the numbers to come down, whatever Conservative politicians I say. People who voted in 2016 for leave, a lot of them wanted the numbers to come down. And probably, although it was never said, I suspect implicitly, a lot of people wanted to see fewer black and brown faces among those immigrants. And what they've actually got, of course, is fewer white European faces and more black and brown faces from Africa and the Indian subcontinent. And yet there hasn't been a big direct backlash against this. But what we've had is a kind of, a projection. So in other words, people have decided that they're not going to worry about labour immigration and all those people from South Asia and all those people from West and East Africa coming to fill the jobs that otherwise had been done by EU citizens, perhaps. What they're going to do is focus their concern and their anxiety on, a few thousand asylum seekers coming across the Channel. So there's almost a sort of displacement, if you like, about the anxiety about immigration in this country. You have in our country, you have a very strange situation where we have absolutely huge net immigration. Nobody seems to be worried about that, but people seem to be worried about asylum seeking. And I assume that is a displacement and a distraction. Your point about think tanks is interesting. I probably, I realise as you were saying it, probably should have said in the book perhaps a little bit more about those. What we have seen is a degree of kind of specialisation in some senses, to sort of use Adam Smith in a way, of think tanks in this country. So you've got Policy Exchange, which has morphed. In some ways it's a microcosm of what's happened to the Conservative Party. It's morphed from being this liberal conservative think tank under David Cameron. It was all about conservative modernisation, Policy Exchange. It was Nick Bowles, who's left the party because he reckons it's become a hard right faction. It was Michael Gove when he was a social liberal. All those people founded Policy Exchange in order to move the Conservative Party towards a more kind of liberal conservatism. It's now become the kind of cutting edge of the culture war for Conservatives. So it's Policy Exchange that set up these commissions of historians to look at the way that the National Trust is presenting history in its historic homes and castles. It's they're looking at the whole statue wars thing. They have a big list. You can go on their website of all the the offences by the liberal chattering elite when it comes to getting rid of statues or changing things in museums or changing curricula in university, all those kind of things. You know, they've become the kind of, to coin a phrase, the kind of witchfinder general, if you like, of the culture war, which is a really bizarre switch. But there are still obviously think tanks who tend to, you know, not concentrate on all that and concentrate on the economics. So, you know, the Centre for Policy Studies, for example, whose head, Rob Colville, was one of the authors of the Conservative Party's manifesto, for example. And the Conservative Party's manifesto, it's interesting what you say about think tanks. Do you have a programme equivalent to one we have in the UK called Dragon's Den? Do you know what I mean? Okay, so there's a bunch of successful business people, 2, 3, 4 of them. Kind of. What happens is that you've got these 3 or 4 business people. It's very, very popular. Well, I don't watch it, but it is very popular. And then you get people who've got business ideas, pitching the idea to them, and then they decide whether to invest in it or not. And the way the Conservative Party ran its manifesto process in 2019 was Dragon's Den. So it basically said to the think tanks, conservative, you know, leaning think tanks, you come in on this day and you pitch us a few ideas for the manifesto. And then, you know, we might take some of them on board. So there was a definite, you know, attempt to actually kind of bring them into the process. And in fact, as I say, Rob actually ended up helping to write the Conservative Party manifesto. Now, how many of those ideas really came from the think tanks is always a moot point, right? Because you can argue actually that the influence of think tanks in the 1970s was overdone. And you will talk to some conservative insiders who say, well, you know, actually we didn't really do very much that those think tanks were suggesting, but they helped sort of change the weather and it was useful. But I do think you're right that perhaps I've slightly downplayed them. So, you know,
it's not criticism. I'm just wondering if
it's a very good point. No, I think it's a very good point. We've already dealt with, you know, whether some politicians are genuinely culturally conservative, in particular Rishi Sunak. I think you're right. I mean, it's very easy to say that this is all instrumental, and that, you know, as per Boris Johnson, you know, these people didn't really believe in what they were doing. All I would say to that is that might be true for some Conservative MPs, but when we were lucky enough to do some survey research with Conservative MPs, asking them the same questions we ask voters and the same questions we ask members, there is a very, very, very pronounced difference between Conservative Party members and voters on the one hand, who are pretty culturally conservative, and Conservative MPs who are actually pretty socially liberal. Okay, they hide it really well, okay, because it's not in their interest to confess that. But most Conservative MPs are like most graduates in that sense. Okay, I'm pretty certain that they don't buy all this statue nonsense. I'm pretty certain they don't buy all this trans anxiety. I'm pretty sure quite a few of them find the whole Rwanda thing pretty distasteful, and you will see that a lot of them are willing to say so anonymously to journalists, but never on the record. So there is a mismatch there. By the way, on transgender rights, that isn't getting as much traction as a lot of conservative, you know, think tanks and people in the media would like. Most people in Britain are not that worried about who goes to the bathroom where. They're just not. And certainly younger people aren't that bothered. And even the older people who are culturally conservative on other matters, you know, about the empire, for example, or about immigration or those kinds of things, it just doesn't get the same traction as it does in the United States of America. And I think sometimes there is a tendency among some culturally conservative MPs and thinkers to think that somehow we are, because of the sort of special relationship, like America, but we're not in that respect. There's a very big difference, and I think it's religion. I think it's religion because, you know, if you are a cultural conservative in America, it's very likely you are an observant Christian. And for you, issues of whether someone is a man or a woman, issues of whether somebody can have a termination or not, they are existential issues. That, you know, actually changing sex is literally an offence against, you know, your God and your way of life. I mean, Britain is an incredibly secular place, and I'm afraid those issues don't have the same traction as a result of that. Your final point, well, your 2 final points. I mean, I think I think you're right to say, is this, to question whether this is an oscillation, an evolution or a transformation. I don't know. I mean, you know, because you've read the book, I slightly hedge my bets on this, I mean, I don't know whether it is a permanent journey. And then finally, has it got wider implications for other parties? Yes, it has, because there's a gravitational pull, obviously, when the government goes one way and you have an opposition that is very scared of alienating those cultural conservative voters. And you can see in the reluctance, for example, of the Labour Party to totally condemn what's going on in Rwanda, but simply to say that it's unworkable and too expensive rather than actually condemn the process as a whole.
Thank you very, very much. Both of you, thank you very much, Emma. The problem is that we've got 15 minutes left, and I know some of you might have questions. The only problem is that we really absolutely have to finish by 5:02, because if not, a certain Eurostar will be missed.
I'll be much briefer in my questions.
So,
my answers.
first of all, can you show us the way in which you gave your talk was just that.
Yeah. And that's why I went on too long, actually, because when I wrote it this morning, I thought, there's not enough there to fill the time, and I thought, so as I was going through, I was expanding on all my points when actually I could have been much quicker. So
it's amazing.
apologies.
I don't know how you followed the extraordinary. So if you've got a question, give your name and who you are, and just let's try and do this very quickly if we can. Sure. So. I know, but I will allow Balkis to go first. Adolfo Oyster. Yeah.
It was a great pleasure to get to listen to you in person.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Balkis Mungu. I'm a first-year PhD student at Oyster University, and my research is focused on the roots of populism, precisely on intellectual roots of this essentially contested concept in the British Conservative Party. And I'm fortunate to have Professor Marshall as my supervisor. Clearly, your book and will certainly be a great help and inspiration for me, as it is the case with all your other works on British populism and the history of the Tory party. I've got two questions. The first concerns the notion of the party in the media, as you explained. Do you think that politicians today, given the 24/7 media coverage and focus on day-to-day politics, have lost the ability to design a coherent legacy, for themselves? And by legacy, I mean what political historians talk about when they study great figures, such as the case of 19th century and 20th century great conservative figures. Of course, the comparison is not possible given the different circumstances, but do you think that this notion of the party in the media has erased the possibility for politicians to leave a solid thought that future political historians can study beyond mere day-to-day reactions? The second concerns the Tories' shift from one political typology to another, the move from mainstream centre-right to populist radical right. And I think you already answered my question, but I will ask again. My question for you is whether you think this shift towards populism and the act of riding the populist wave is made possible by the fact that the populist logic is an integral part of the party's identity or the party's ideological DNA. But I think you already answered the question, so sorry for taking it.
Okay, well, that's okay. Let's leave the second one then, because we have talked about it a little bit. I mean, I think your first question is a very profound one, and that's the extent to which any politician in the postmodern age, if you want to call it the 21st century at least, is actually capable of putting together the kind of ideological program or, as you put it, legacy that we associate with politicians of the past. I mean, so someone like Margaret Thatcher, for example, or even Harold Macmillan, if you want to talk about a more kind of one-nation conservative. I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really good question, because I think you're right that the kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of 24/7 media and social media actually effectively has left us with a generation of politicians who, not to put too fine a point on it, have got ADHD. They simply, do not have the time And probably now I wonder whether they even have the capability, the capacity to do what you would like them to do as an intellectual historian. I mean, fortunately, you're not having to study this generation in a way. You're able to study some politicians of the past. But I do think that it is going to be a problem. And by the way, it's also, I think, possibly going to be a problem. And this is a kind of wider point about, political history, I guess, less so intellectual history, perhaps. Where are the archives going to be? Yeah. Now that they've set their WhatsApps to make messages disappear after a certain amount of time. We're not even going to have those, and so much is going on now. On the phone, on messaging. That I do wonder, having spent obviously some time myself in archives where you've got so much. You've got memos going back to and forth, letters, etc., etc. Where is that going to end up? The good thing is, I guess, for an intellectual historian, is now that people can publish reports or speeches or blogs or whatever with think tanks, that there might be a lot more of that material. So great for you, less good for those of us who want to study the kind of internal mechanisms of parties.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Adolfo Neves. I'm a second-year student of the MA Political Ideas in the Digital Age, and I'm currently writing a thesis, interestingly, on surveillance capitalism. And at some point, it's somehow linked to how protectionist parties, conservative parties, for example, actually happen to rise to power. We could look at the United States, we could look at the UK, for example, and how the digital age actually has played a role in it. But right now, I just have two very quick questions I would like to present, and those questions are actually related to a few of the topics you've mentioned there, and the fact that in the Conservative Party there are some, I would say, some centers of power. We have the militants on the other hand, and then we have those who actually are the decision makers of the party at some point. Now, recently, today I actually just happened to come across the news that Dominic Raab happened to resign from his post. Now, I would just like to understand very briefly, would this have to do with this clashes of power within the Conservative Party at some point? Does it actually happen to be a possibility that Dominic Raab felt some sort of pressure within the party to actually just resign from his seat and give it to someone else? And now the second question I have has to do with how we've been dealing with the crisis on migration, for example, in the UK, how the UK has actually managed to deal with this situation. Now, currently we have this government from Rishi Sunak, and we have there Suella Braverman as well. Now, there's something very interesting that I actually happened to see just, I think, a few weeks ago, and has to do with the public opinion on this matter. Now, a few people actually happen to believe that in the Conservative Party, there's a chance we use people, or we have this image, we have the militants, those who actually share the word, the ideas of the party, and we have those that make the decisions, but we have people like Rishi Sunak, for example, or Suella Braverman, who happen to be the face of the party. And some people believe that they happen to be there at some point only to enforce these ideas on migration, on being very protectionist, on being very harsh at some point. Because I probably heard Professor Tim Bale mentioning that this is a draconian idea of sending people to Rwanda, for example. Now, I would just like to know, what is your personal opinion on this matter, and if there's a chance these are related? Okay,
on Raab, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I think that is more of a kind of personal problem that he has controlling his temper, but possibly accelerated by the 24/7 media, which to some extent forces politicians to achieve and do things rather more quickly than they otherwise would have to. So there might be something structural there. I think on Braverman and Sunak, I mean, I think you're right to say that to some extent they are the face of a wider government policy, but I think also that they drive it, and particularly with Braverman, I think she, in campaigning for the leadership after the next election, very much sees this as, her route to popularity with the grassroots of the Conservative Party. So, once again, it's both an ideological predilection on her part for that kind of immigration policy, but it is also clearly instrumental on her part. In other words, she knows it goes down well, and therefore, it is something that she is going to hold on to as long as possible. And for Rishi Sunak, it's also slightly instrumental in the sense that he felt that he had to appoint Suella Braverman as the Interior Minister, as Home Secretary, because without her, he might not have had sufficient support among MPs to put Boris Johnson off standing again. So I think the things are very interrelated, but it's a good question.
I think we have to have the last question with Asta.
Yeah. My name is Astanova. I'm from Hungary.
Okay.
So you summarize the European situation, continental situation with populist parties, but I haven't heard a single word about Russia. So all these things have been obviously influenced and carefully nurtured for a decade by Russian secret services and whatnot. So what is the situation with the Conservative Party?
Well, I mean, if you read the book, although I'm not suggesting that you necessarily need to, but there was a very interesting so-called Russia report in the UK about the extent to which Russia may or may not have intervened to help the Leave side in the 2016 referendum. And some of that report was redacted, so we don't know exactly what it said. But what we do know is that the government under Boris Johnson sat on that report for nearly a year to ensure that it didn't come out at any kind of embarrassing moment. Eventually came out and did suggest some quite worrying things. And actually, as well, it's important to realise that the Conservative Party's finances are pretty murky and rely on high net worth individuals, so very rich people as donors. And a lot of those donors either made their money in Russia or continue to make money from Russia. And therefore, there is a suspicion that the UK, and in particular the Conservative Party, went easier on Russia than they might otherwise have done, even when, on the other hand, the government of the UK felt that Russia had essentially attacked the UK by the chemical attack on the Skripals. So I think the Conservative Party has a difficult and ambiguous relationship with Russia, or had. I think that's changed because of Ukraine. I think now, Russian money, Russian links are out of the question for the Conservative Party. Having said that, however, and this is where I'll finish, they're certainly not out of the question, as you probably know, for London. And there is an awful lot of the London economy that still relies on Russian money and will continue to do so. And there are an awful lot of so-called respectable accountancy and law firms in Britain who make vast amounts of money from the Russian oligarchs all around the world.
Yeah, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Please,
Thank you.
I know.
Yeah.
For those of you who would like to read the book, this is it.
Thank you. You've got to stop.
Thank you for listening.